Okay, thanks everyone for joining this webinar. My name's Lucas Cernisak. I'll be moderating and introducing Dr. Jamie Cleverly. So thank you for being here. We're really excited to have you join us. So to start today, and in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians throughout Australia, New Zealand, and all nations. We honor their profound connections to land, water, biodiversity, and culture, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people continue to play within our community. Again, thank you to you all for joining us. For those that haven't met me, my name is Lucas Cernisak, lead of TERN's Ecosystem Processes platform. TERN's Ecosystem Processes platform monitors the environment at a high level of detail and at a small number of representative sites. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the Ecosystem Processes platform during Jamie's talk. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the webcast using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll take some time toward the end of the webinar to answer some of these questions. Also, we've set up a rating survey that appears in a separate browser as you leave the meeting. If you could take a couple of minutes to complete this will assist us in our preparation of webinars in the future, and also in the TERN reporting. So the webinar today is recorded, and so that we can share it with those who could not attend following the webinar. So this is a presentation of the OzFlux webinar series, and also supported by TERN Ecosystem Processes. And you can see here the supporting institutions that are also part of OzFlux and TERN. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamie Cleverly. He's the Associate Director for OzFlux, the Principal Investigator for TERN's Alice Mulga Super Site, and a Senior Research Fellow at University of Technology, Sydney. Jamie's research interests include land-atmosphere exchange of carbon and water, and ecosystems more generally, ecohydrology, ecophysiology, meteorology, climate statistics, and agronomy. In this OzFlux webinar, Jamie will discuss the inference of ecological processes which shape Australian ecosystems from the measurement of patterns. And the webinar will showcase how measurements of fluxes, vegetation structure, and other factors which drive ecological processes improve our understanding of how and why ecosystem change occurs over minutes, days, seasons, and years. Welcome, Jamie, and I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen now so that Jamie can share his.
Thanks, Lucas. Let's see here. That should be up now. So as Lucas mentioned, I'm going to be talking about ecological processes. And as we've been chatting amongst ourselves, we're talking about ecological processes with a little p, as opposed to ecological processes with a capital P, which is a part of TERN, and we will be talking about that as well today. And I want to acknowledge that Lucas and Jason will also be contributing to this webinar to talk about the ecosystem processes and OzFlux platforms. Now, if I can get it to go to the next slide. There we go. So ecosystem processes and ecosystem functioning are sort of synonymous for how the ecosystem operates, the how and why, rather than the what and the where. And so some ecosystem processes that you can think of could be nutrient cycling, decomposition, soil movement, carbon dynamics, trophic and competitive interactions. A lot of these processes we don't observe directly, but we have to, but we actually learn about them from observing landscape patterns. And so we look at patterns of composition, configuration, structure, texture, and then we identify organism traits. We identify some of the extra ecological processes that occur, which affect which affect these landscape patterns and processes to create what we see in the world. So what I want to talk about today is largely how we go from observations of landscape patterns to landscape processes, and actual, or more specifically, ecological patterns to ecological processes. I'm just showing this landscape framework because this is the landscape ecologists have really run with this paradigm. The way that we infer processes from patterns, there are a few different ways. One is through experimental hypothesis testing. So we observe the patterns, we hypothesize what the processes could be that are creating those patterns, and then we test those hypotheses. We can also do this through modeling, either statistical modeling or simulation modeling or mechanistic modeling, to infer processes from the patterns that we see. And then we can use that information on processes to predict the patterns that we might see down the track. And going through this sort of circular framework allows us to refine what we understand of the processes that are creating the patterns that we see. So some of the ways that we can infer function, one of them are from climate transects. And so what I'm showing here is the North Australian tropical transect, which is a really good place for trying to understand the relationship between precipitation and ecosystem functioning, as well as ecosystem patterns. Statistical hypothesis testing, which is something that's really quite dear to my heart. Ecophysiology as well, ecohydrology, process models, but a lot of this has to do with interdisciplinary research. And so we look at multiple disciplines to understand what's going on in the ecosystem as the mechanisms which create that ecosystem structure or those ecosystem patterns. So I have some examples from Mulga, because Mulga has some really interesting distributional patterns that have been the basis for trying to understand the processes of Mulga biogeography across Australia. So there are a couple different kinds of patterns that you can see Mulga growing in. One, as you can see on the left of the screen, is what we call banded vegetation. So the Mulga forms bands, often associated with dunes, because they like a specific part of the dune. Mulga also grow in groves, as for example, you can see on a lot of sand plains. Now, what we do when we're looking at understanding these the processes that create these patterns is we look for patterns in other related measurements. So, for example, what you see here is soil water content, and there are particular patterns of soil moisture with respect to the distribution of Mulga. Pretty much the soil moisture is always about the same between rainstorms. But what's really key in understanding the processes that create these patterns is seeing what happens to soil moisture following rain, because what we tend to see is the soil is a lot wetter in the tree groves than in the intergroves, and this is related this is ultimately related to runoff, run-on relationships, that are following these trigger events, and particularly interactions with other kinds of vegetation. So you can, for example, you get grass bands can capture rainwater and prevent deposition of sediment on their downslope extent, which gives a really ideal place for mulga to grow. And so that's why you tend to find mulga bands associated with these grass bands as the topography of the landscape is developed through runoff erosion and run-on processes. So in TERN, as Lucas has already mentioned, we are focused on ecosystem processes in TERN at some key locations across the continent, where we measure fluxes of carbon, water, and energy. And I'll go into that in a bit more in a little while. But we also look at some of the things that that can be affecting these fluxes. And these are things such as climate, soil, vegetation structure, phenology, and we're also measuring acoustics. Now, fluxes are, in a strict sense, we refer to fluxes as a process. So we're talking about, for example, photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, because actually what we're measuring are patterns in water vapor density, in wind speed, vertical wind speed, and CO2 density, and temperature. And then we're using a model to infer the processes, the flux processes, such as photosynthesis, from those measurements. These ecosystem processes sites really want to look at the big picture. And so we work a lot with the biodiversity plots in TERN surveillance, as well as landscape information. We try to pull all of this together with our flux towers, all into a single location, so that we can infer these processes from a wealth of different measurements. And so I will move next to Lucas to talk about the ecosystem processes platform.
Okay, thanks, Jamie, and thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about ecosystem processes. So I've taken over the role of lead toward the end of last year from Will Edwards, and it's a pleasure to be involved in TERN and ecosystem processes. So the ecosystem processes is one of 3 measurement platforms in TERN, along with surveillance and landscapes. And you can see in the diagram to the left of the slide a little bit of the flow of data into the sort of analysis system. And in ecosystem processes, we're really focused on the kind of the bottom of that diagram, which is why do we see changes happening, and what can we learn about processes? How can we detect change? And these things are inherently time series type questions. So as Jamie mentioned, they're processes. That means they have time in the denominator and their rate variables. Okay, next slide. So ecosystem processes has about 16 super sites, and 4 of these at the moment are described as affiliate super sites. But overall, each of these sites is equipped with a detailed set of measurements of eddy covariance and meteorology being the kind of the baseline, and then additional measurements that we'll look at in the next couple of slides. But I would, some of you may be familiar with these. I would draw your attention to a new super site, which we're in the process of setting up, which is in Fletcherview, about 2 hours drive from Townsville in Queensland. And this is a tropical rangeland site. So we expect to learn really interesting things about how a managed ecosystem behaves in that context. And there are really interesting questions around competition between trees and grasses, woody thickening, and carbon sequestration. Okay, next slide. So the science applications are as I mentioned, looking at disturbance, effects of disturbance, topography, biodiversity, land use, land management, and of course, extreme weather events in Australia are really important. and as well as the longer term variations in climate. So we're interested in those kind of questions. In addition to that, these sites provide excellent ground truthing for calibrating and validating remote sensing products, measurements from satellites. And in addition to modeling, testing model predictions as well. So typical questions are, what kind of drivers of ecosystem productivity? What are the drivers of greenhouse gas emissions? So the carbon cycling type questions. How is ecosystem productivity and biodiversity related to the variable climate, especially with sort of interannual climate variability associated with El Nino, La Nina? And then finally leads into the final question again about the water cycle. And water is such an important resource in Australia. So what can we learn from these sites about water use efficiency of vegetation, how that is changing, how it might continue to change in the future, and what are the implications of that for runoff and the availability of freshwater resources? So the methods, as I mentioned, are that each site has a kind of baseline data collection, and these are focused around eddy covariance and the micrometeorology measurements. Of course, it includes other useful and interesting measurements as well: soil temperature, air temperature, all of the weather, and then Jamie will talk a bit more about the calculated products that come out of that. But we're really looking at trying to get at the carbon, water, and energy balances from these eddy covariance measurements. And then the idea of the super sites is that we so those kind of measurements would happen at the OzFlux sites. The idea around the super sites and the ecosystem processes super sites is that we would make these additional measurements that can provide ancillary information, contextual information, information about biodiversity. So some of the things that are highlights, I think, are the acoustic sensors that give a measurement of the acoustic soundscape. The PhenoCam network is now up and running, and so this provides information about phenology, for example, that can be especially useful for looking at competition between different types of plants, grasses and trees. Leaf area index is a really important parameter, especially in modeling. And so the calibration of remote sensing products for leaf area index is an important role for the ecosystem processes sites. And each site then may also have some additional measurements that are specific to the site and the specific context. But the idea is that we have these baseline kind of uniformly collected data that are available to the community, to you all to use for your research, and it provides long-term measurements of these properties. So looking into the future, what other opportunities are there? So from my own perspective, in my own research, I think there's really an opportunity to look at stable isotopes in the fluxes of carbon and water. And this can be really useful for partitioning these fluxes, especially in the case, for example, of evapotranspiration. So we can measure how much water evaporates from an ecosystem, but that evaporation is coming both from soils and from plants. And some of the things we'd really like to know is how much are the plants contributing, how much is the soil contributing. And by measuring the isotopic composition of these different fluxes, we can partition them. And so this is really complementary to the measurement of the net fluxes by eddy covariance. So these, of course, are challenging measurements to make. We probably wouldn't roll them out to all the sites immediately, or it'd be prohibitively expensive. But I think we could certainly start by making at some key sites by making some of these measurements. So that's what I personally am very, very interested in developing in the future. And then finally, just another word is to say that this truly is national research infrastructure, these ecosystem processes sites. And I think it's a great resource to make use of also for campaign style measurements. So these are just 3 examples of papers that I was involved in. And in this case, this involved researchers supported by TERN, but also other funding sources, visiting the sites, using the infrastructure and the data collection that's ongoing, and then making additional measurements. So in this case, these are sort of physiology-based measurements that are made a couple of times, maybe twice, once in the wet season, once in the dry season, or in the warm season versus cool season. And this provides also really useful information at the continental scale, so across this nice range of diverse sites. So I really encourage anyone that's interested to get in touch with me or any of my ecosystem processes colleagues, Jamie, for example, and Jason. And if you have ideas, we'd be more than happy to discuss. So yeah, thanks very much. I'll pass back to Jamie at this stage.
Thanks, Lucas. So really, as we are ultimately talking about the OzFlux webinar and ecosystem exchange, I wanted to put the water, carbon, and energy cycles right in the center of everything. And so what we're looking at are, so for example, in the water cycle, we have various drivers of ecosystem processes like precipitation, radiation exchange, but we also have processes that include evaporation, transpiration from vegetation, and so on, like Lucas was saying. The carbon cycle, similar sort of thing. We're looking at some of the fluxes and flows are related to ecosystem processes such as respiration and photosynthesis. But we're still also interested in things in the carbon cycle and things like fire and erosion as having an effect, being drivers of these processes. And finally, energy cycles. So discussion of fluxes is not complete without water, carbon, and energy. And so we also look at the integration of the carbon and water cycles through the energy cycle, as well as providing some constraints on our water and carbon cycles. So now we're going to move to Jason to give us a little background about the OzFlux side of ecosystem processes.
Thanks, Jamie. Very good day to everyone. And I'd just like to follow on from the discussion around ecosystem processes within TERN that's already been discussed, and talk about OzFlux as a community. And really, OzFlux is a critical and integral component of TERN and TERN ecosystem processes platform in particular. And all of the ecosystem processes sites, as Lucas has already mentioned, all of the super sites have OzFlux towers as part of those facilities. And so they're all OzFlux sites, but the OzFlux community and the OzFlux sites go far beyond just ecosystem processes TERN community. And recently, TERN has supported the OzFlux community. So over the last 10 years, we have had financial support from TERN to operate, to provide important information back to TERN ecosystem processes. But as I said, OzFlux is much broader than just TERN ecosystem processes, and we can consider ourselves as what I'd like to call a community of practice. And that is, on the one hand, we are a community, a group of people with common interests around OzFlux, around TERN ecosystem processes, around answering all of the sorts of science questions that have been elucidated already by Jamie and Lucas. So on the one hand, we're a community. We have shared perspectives and knowledge. We have both data providers and data users within the OzFlux community. And we have a really strong sense of belonging and collaboration within our community. We have a domain that we operate in, so it's a shared interest and vision of OzFlux. We have an independent governance, but we have a shared vision in terms of the types of questions that we're trying to answer. And finally, in terms of the practice component, really about implementing our combined collective knowledge and experience that then drives research and publications, innovation and application, as Lucas has already mentioned, within TERN ecosystem process. So combined, we consider ourselves a community of practice that contributes overall to this understanding of ecosystem processes to address key questions and challenges across the landscape that involves both observations, modelling and remote sensing across a number of different scales. Those key questions we've teased out in the previous OzFlux 20th anniversary conference. We teased out a number of themes that are now becoming part of the 20th anniversary OzFlux paper to appear in Global Change Biology shortly. And those themes really reiterate what Jamie and Lucas has already said. So I'm not going to go through those point by point here. So we'll move to the next slide. Thanks, Jamie. And in terms of OzFlux, it is one part of the toolkit that we have for understanding ecosystem process and function. And if we think about ecosystem processes and function, this is a good diagram from Chang, just a recent one from 2000, from this year, showing both what we measure in terms of the OzFlux component, which is the green box I've highlighted there, which is what comes in and what goes out in terms of carbon. But they also show a number of other ecosystem processes, including the importance of nitrogen in the system. And so what we're providing here in terms of the types of measurements that OzFlux is making around energy, water and carbon fluxes, really at this whole sort of ecosystem level. But we have the opportunity to drill down there in the ecosystem processes to have a look at individual processes or traits within ecosystems to investigate that in more detail. And in that paper by Cheng et al., they've also shown that biogeochemical cycles are important, which we've known for some time, but they do highlight the importance of nitrogen in limiting ecosystems. And so I think that's somewhere where we could potentially do a lot better within OzFlux is our measurement and understanding of nitrogen limitations. There's also potentially scope. I had a list here of other things that we could add to in terms of our improvement of ecosystems that we don't currently do well. Those are measurements of volatile organic carbon compounds, nitrogen cycle I mentioned, stress responses, critical zone interactions. And there's many applications over space and time scales, and so I'll show you a couple of recent examples from the last 2 years. First is just looking at site scale. So really, the OzFlux data tends to be used at 3 scales, either at the site scale, regional scale, or at the global scale. And just some examples from our community in the last couple of years. This one's from Anne Griebel's group and their group, looking at the impact of heat waves. And so carbon and water fluxes traditionally have often been assumed to be coupled together through stomatal regulation during dry conditions. And what they did was they looked at the impact of heat waves over 3 summers at Wombat State Forest. And what they showed in the right-hand diagram, you'll see the average response of the ecosystem over the 24 hours of the day and the carbon flux, the vertical axis. The positive numbers are an uptake of carbon and the negative numbers are a release of carbon. And what they showed here is that the uptake of carbon, the GPP or gross primary production, is basically not affected terribly much by the drought, but there is a change in the amount of water that they use and hence water use efficiency of the forests. And there is a massive increase in the amount of respiration from the ecosystems, 137% increase in ecosystem respiration during these periods. So interestingly, not too affected, the productivity is not too affected by heat waves, but the overall net carbon balance becomes a source following or during and following these heat wave events. So that has implications then in terms of the future responses of eucalypt forests in terms of becoming carbon sources in the future. Another example here, just looking at regional scale. So this is looking at a number of sites along the North Australian tropical transect, which has already been mentioned previously. Here, trying to understand and partition out the differences between trees and grasses across savanna ecosystems, which has traditionally been quite a difficult task, particularly because trees and grasses are two different functional, C3 and C4. And so Zhulong Ma and their group, along with Alfredo, came up with a new model based on phenological data from satellites to partition out the tree and grass growth separately. And what they did was they used some OzFlux data, and you'll see in the top part of the diagram, figures A and B, they used the flux data to validate their models to make sure that it was giving the right productivity across a range of sites along the North Australian tropical transect, and then they extrapolated that over both space and time. And what they showed was that it's highly seasonal, particularly the grass is highly responsive to differences in wet season precipitation and hydroclimatic variability. There's spatial differences along the NAT, and what this work shows is that because the grasses are so sensitive, that and they get more sensitive as you move towards Jamie's sites down in Alice, that this is going to be affected by any changes in hydroclimatic variability in the future. Next one, Jamie. The third scale is the global scale, and this is where our data get used in either metadata or synthesis. Here's an example from Dave Campbell and in their group just recently in Nature Comms this year. This is looking at methane emissions now, and Dave's group have contributed methane measurements from their site at Kapurtai Bog in New Zealand, and that contributes to a global database of methane fluxes. And traditionally, models of methane emission, they're very important for understanding global carbon budgets and ecosystem assessments, but they've always been previously a linear and static temperature sensitivity is assumed in the models. So what they did was took all of the measurements, including the ones from New Zealand, and showed that in fact there was a hysteresis of temperature, and that the relationship was not linear, and suggesting that there is a larger methane sensitivity to temperature, and that there's obviously work to be done there in terms of improving the mechanistic model parameterization for these global models. Thanks, Jamie. And the other thing that is becoming more important is the length of record. So we have 20 years of flux record at our two longest sites now at Howard Springs and Tumbarumba. And this provides us with an excellent opportunity to examine the long-term trends of various ecosystem processes and function, how that varies with climate change and climate variability. And one measure of ecosystem function is what we call water use efficiency. It's how much water is used per gram of carbon that is taken up in productivity. And we can see at the 20 years on the top diagram from Howard Springs and from the Tumbarumba that there's a significant increasing trend of water use efficiency over the 20 years at both of those sites. And it's only really when you get more than a decade or more of data that you're able to start to discern some of these trends, because there is a lot of interannual variability. There's also, just go back one quickly. Thanks, Jamie. It's also useful to have longer data sets for examining interannual climate variability and modes of climate variability, such as El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is occurring on timescales of 7 years or so. you need longer data sets, more than 20 years, to start to address those influences. All right, thanks, Jamie. In terms of uniqueness, a couple of recent studies showing the uniqueness of the OzFlux network. And a recent one by Andy Pittman's group showed that out of the 97 hottest countries globally, that they had no flux towers in them at all. And the 98th hottest country was Australia. And we have an extensive network. So we're certainly punching above our weight there in terms of providing fluxes within these high temperature zones. There's very little capability in other countries to step forward just due to socioeconomic drivers. Now, the fact that we're in such a high temperature zone, the vegetation in Australia is adapted to that high temperature and rainfall variability, and so that offers an important insight for modelers that is not attainable elsewhere across the globe. And the just back one, thanks, Jeremy. And it gives us an insight into how they might function in the future. The variability is not only large for climate drivers, but is also very large for ecosystem response. And the bottom right diagram shows the coefficient of variation for precipitation on the left, and Australia as a continent in the yellow there against all the other continents, and productivity on the right. So both the drivers and the responses in terms of productivity have very large coefficients of variation. So it's so we have an important role to play in global data. Next one. In terms of impacts, just added these up the other day. We have now over 50,000 downloads of OzFlux data from the FluxNet 2015 collection across 23 sites. We have almost 500 peer-reviewed publications since 1999 across a wide range of science application and theory. And we have quite a broader, larger research impact of OzFlux. If we look at the Google Scholar references, around 1,290. We're also important in terms of training the next generation of researchers, which are interdisciplinary in nature, as Jamie's already pointed out, very unique skill sets to do these sorts of work. And we provide a lot of innovation as well. Next slide. This is the last one. So we provide a lot of innovation and contribute to theoretical and practical aspects in the past 30 years, starting from work in the Pi Lab. And that continues. We've had continual innovation by our TERN central node, particularly Pete Isaac, Ian McHugh, Cecilia, and Miko, driving a lot of that innovation in terms of software and theoretical understanding as well. And they have managed to incorporate much of the understanding and knowledge that comes from OzFlux and incorporate that into those technical aspects. So thank you very much, guys, for that. We have had recently gap-filling approaches for nitrous oxide, Dave Campbell's group from New Zealand, and other machine learning from Appin Mohabedi. So we're contributing there in the last couple of years. And also just look at recent innovation, the work from Anne Griebel, looking at spatial inhomogeneities and sites. And all sites are inherently inhomogeneous. It's just the extent to which they're inhomogeneous. And that introduces a variability in the carbon budget estimates that can propagate to the biome scale if those measurements are used verbatim. And so Anne has devised a solution to quantify the variability of vegetation characteristics to account for non-uniform of sampling. And importantly now, that is being used, and the recent paper shows this now being used within NEON. So we're contributing those ideas, or Anne's contributing those ideas to global data processing efforts. All right. And I guess just also a welcome to anyone that would like to join the OzFlux community. A very friendly, welcoming bunch. So feel free to get in touch with us if you would like to join the OzFlux network as well.
All right, thanks, Jason. So now I want to turn to some of the main drivers of ecosystem processes in Australia. And the first would always have to be fire. Australia has been a continent adapted to fire for many, many, many millions of years, going back all the way past the KT boundary. There are some dynamics to the fire regime in Australia. So as you can see on this map on the right, that as you go toward the north to the northern savannas, you start to get to where you're getting fires every year or 2 fires every 3 years. They don't tend to be as intense as, say, down in southeastern Australia, where you have these big, massive fires after the fuel builds up over decades, and as we saw in 2019. Another key driver of ecosystem processes in Australia is aridity, and aridity hasn't been around for quite as long, yet 5 million years is still pretty long in relation to a lot of other continents on the planet. So for the last 5 million years, say during the late Miocene, Pliocene, we saw in Central Australia a monsoonal marshy savanna that actually even went back to much earlier, to the mid-late Eocene. As we've gone from being pretty much 100% rainforest in Australia as little as 30 million years ago, we are now about 70% of the continent is arid land, and that has a strong impact on the functioning of these ecosystems and what they can do with respect to photosynthesis, respiration, and so on. The really big one, and it's the most recent, so in the last, say, 2.5 million years, we've been seeing a trend toward a lot of climate extremes or climate variability. So fluctuating between landscapes that look practically dead to landscapes that look almost like a garden, like a Japanese garden. And so I'm mostly going to be talking about climate variability with respect to driving ecosystem processes in Australia. As you know, it's a land of droughts and flooding rains. And so in Central Australia, we see a 40-fold variability in rainfall from the driest year in 1928. The driest year before 2018 was 1928, when we received 25 millimeters of rain that year. I never actually expected to see that ever again, and then we saw it 2 years in a row in 2018 and 2019. Then on the wetter side, we've seen almost 1 meter of rainfall in this very same location, and the vegetation and ecosystems are able to function through this large amount of variability, taking advantage of the favorable conditions and surviving, maybe not even surviving across the dry conditions, but showing the resilience to come back later anyway. So when we're looking at ecosystem function, one of the things we'll look at is net ecosystem productivity, or the balance between photosynthesis and respiration. Thus, a net ecosystem productivity value of 0 means that photosynthesis is perfectly balanced to respiration. We've seen over the last 20 years or so a very strong temporal correlation between total water storage, greenness, and productivity. In fact, during the very wet, productive years of 2010, 2011, we saw a massive increase in the ability of Australian ecosystems to take up carbon, but that didn't, that was even though it just followed on from the millennium drought, as you can, which occurred pretty much through about 2006, with 2009 also being a very dry year. And then it's right back into dry again. And the functioning of these ecosystems seems to really match well with these climate extremes, which Australia has been seeing for probably 2.5 million years. Another interesting feature is that fire emissions peaked just following during the drought that just followed this big land sink anomaly in 2010, which suggests that a large amount of the fire emissions in Australia, because of its 70% arid nature, are associated with the rangelands which are generally fuel limited, and so they tend to burn just after it's wet, as opposed to the eucalypt forests, which are fuel moisture limited, and so they tend to burn after you've had a bit of drought for a little while. So another key feature, especially when you're talking about future climate change of ecosystems, are pivot points, where a pivot point describes the rainfall that's required for an ecosystem to switch from a net carbon source, so when it's dry, to become a net carbon sink. And we see two very different pivot points for mulga woodlands versus very open Carimbia savannas with hummock grasses. And this is related to the allocation in mulga, which tends toward a lot of net carbon storage, so that they can get through the dry times and then come back during the wet times, as opposed to the functioning of our hummock grasses, which grow like gangbusters during the wet times, and then they just pretty much all of their above ground tissue photodegrades in the sun during the dry times. This is also shown in the seasonal phenology, and I'll call your attention to panel F, which is at the southern end of the North Australian tropical transect. So when I'm talking about phenology, you probably all know, but I'll restate it anyway. The phenology is the study of the sequence and timing of events in a life cycle. What's key about the tea tree site is that during some of the drier years, there is no phenology. There's no greening, there's no growing season. Whereas up in the tropical savannas, it's pretty much green all year round, but you can still see a climate signal because of the influence of the understory grass layer. Now, mulga resilience. So we know that mulga is resilient to these very dry periods, even when it experiences mortality. But the dynamics of that actually depends on hydrology, on the soil and soil moisture specifically. So when the return of rains is strong enough to saturate the soil, the near surface soil just under the mulga, then we'll see an immediate favorable response in our NEP, in net ecosystem productivity, to the coming of the rains. Whereas when the rain is spread out a bit more and it doesn't quite saturate the soil, the mulgas take a bit longer to respond, and they don't respond as well. And one of the key factors that we're looking at when we're looking at ecosystem processes is access to water. And so we've been using stable isotopes of carbon to look at water use efficiency. So when trees are really happy, when they have heaps of water and their stomata are wide open, they'll tend to have low water use efficiency. And so what we found is that the patterns of Carimbia that we see in the Australian inlands is that we tend to see a heap more corymbias in the open savannas than we do in mulga patches. And what we found using the stable isotopes is that their very low water use efficiency in the open savanna is related to their ability to access groundwater because of the hard pan that exists under the acacias. The mulgas exist on these hard pans where they can keep water close to their roots. And so they're kind of an exception to this national figure by Ruman and others, where you can see that the water use efficiency in red gum and the water use efficiency in corymbia is a lot lower than you'd expect given the amount of rain it gets, and that actually the river red gum, even though they're getting 300 millimeters of rain a year, they function as if they were getting 1,500 to 2,000 millimeters of rain a year, suggesting that they're groundwater dependent in this situation. And so I wanted to just quickly, in the last few minutes, bring up the OzCZO, Australia's new critical zone observatory, because here we're focusing on the water cycle, and critical zone science tries to integrate information between the bedrock, groundwater, soil, land surface, ecology, and atmosphere. So it's an interface between the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the ecosphere. Sorry, excuse me. And what we're setting up in Australia, so you'll see some of the sites in this OzCZO network are already TERN super sites, ecosystem processes super sites, such as Alice Mulga and Calparum and Gingin. We also, the new Fletcher View site that you can see here will be an ancillary CZO site where we can actually, where we're looking in the Burdekin Basin, which is responsible for runoff into the Great Barrier Reef, as well as the Moreton Bay site, which is looking at ecosystem processes in the coastal region. So, and the way that we do this, and I really wanted to focus on this angle bore that we'll be putting in at the sites. This angle bore is for going to be really useful for monitoring things like drainage, because one thing that we have a hard time doing in ecosystem processes is making soil moisture measurements below the root zone. And so one of the things that the critical zone infrastructure gives us is a measurement below the root zone, so that we can actually start looking at drainage and root water uptake in a more meaningful way. And of course, leveraging off of the existing infrastructure at the TERN ecosystem processes sites, and particularly the flux towers. Now, one last thing I wanted to really quickly touch upon was kind of why we need to understand ecosystem processes. And one is for prediction and forecasting. And what I'm showing here is some background on the NEON Ecological Forecasting Challenge, of which I was a member of the design team on their second theme on predicting carbon and water fluxes. We are starting up something similar under the National Environmental Prediction System in Australia for an Australian forecasting initiative. So get back to me or TERN if you'd like to get the contact information for the Slack channel where we are discussing how we're going to go about doing this forecasting. And so one of the last things I'm jumping in on is looking at ecosystem functioning and as it relates to predictability. And this is looking at, and so what you're seeing here is a study that we just published last year, just as COVID was starting to heat up, on the predictability of productivity, water use, and heat stress across agricultural ecosystems in Australia and New Zealand, where we find important nonlinearities which affect ecosystem function, as well as issues relating to management, so low predictability and lucerne. So, and when I say predictability, I mean predictability from environmental factors, and that's because lucerne's productivity and water use are strongly related to the phenology of cutting the crop. And so I'm not actually going to spend any time on this, but other than to say that predictability might be a bit of a sticky wicket. In some cases, it'll be easy. In other cases, possibly not so much. And that is my last slide. So thanks everyone for tuning in and listening, and I'll give it back to Lucas now.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, a couple of questions. One, so you just discussed sort of fire and water in Australia as really strong drivers of ecosystem performance. And I suppose the other thing, of course, that's kind of unique about Australia is the really old, highly weathered soils, that have been burnt so many times that the nutrient availability is really low. What can you comment on the role of nutrients, for example, in those Central Australian ecosystems? How do you see that importance coming into things?
Yeah, the nutrients in Central Australia are really interesting because mulga tend to be situated on soils that are really quite nitrogen rich. Pretty much everything's phosphorus poor, but we haven't really studied that too much in Central Australia. I believe that I was recently reading that the fluctuations in climate are so great that they kind of drown out any potential signal from nutrients. But I want to get back to the mulga, which are have very nitrogen-rich soils because they form a mutualism with cyanobacteria, as opposed nitrogen-fixing plants. Now, they do not overlap with the biogeography of the hummock grasses, and the hummock grasses actually perform quite poorly if you give them too much nitrogen. They're pretty much only found on nitrogen-poor soils. So there is a story to tell about nutrients. In some ways, I think that the vegetation has, because of the long time period of low nutrients, they've kind of figured it out and adapted mechanisms for dealing with that. And so for the hummock grasses, they deal with low nutrients by having extremely high water use efficiency, so that they don't really need a lot of photosynthetic capacity to generate a large amount of photosynthesis.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, super interesting. And Jason, a question.
I've got a question as well. Since
we have jump in, go for it. Yeah.
None in the Q&A box at the moment. So if anyone would like to ask a question, there's still time. Go ahead and pop it in the Q&A box. But a quick one for Jamie. I like the concept of pivot points, and you showed that these systems are very resilient. And so I wonder what you think about the concept of threshold, whether they even apply in these systems where you might get to a point where there is non-reversible change in the system, or are they just too resilient? Are they just doesn't apply in these systems?
Yeah, in the range of 25 mil to a meter of rainfall, I actually haven't seen any. The lines are pretty linear. And I am working on a study right now where I'm comparing mortality and resilience across other continents. And I think Australia is pretty special that the plants have figured out how to deal with these climate extremes for the last couple million years. So no, I haven't seen a threshold for a state change. Now, that's not to say there aren't thresholds for state changes in other parts of Australia, just not where I've been working.
Okay, we we do have a question in the Q&A. I'll read that for you, Jamie. It says, from Greg Brennan, research in South Africa game parks suggests that acacia trees need competition from understory grasses to begin sequestering in. In Australia, we've grazed out most of the grasses in mulga country, and despite the high end levels in mulga lands, maybe it's shut down the end fixation and factories. What do you think about that in terms of what are the things that stimulate end fixation, and how is management of Australian arid landscapes maybe impacted on that?
Yeah, that sounds a bit like you're talking about Queensland and grazing out the grasses in the mulga. Out on the cattle station where I've been working, the cattle really only turn up to our mulga stand when it's been so wet that the floodplains are underwater, because they don't really handle being underwater too well. So I actually have to go back to the literature and look at that, because I'm not really sure what drives nitrogen fixation in the mulgas right now. Sorry about that.
Okay, great. Well, that takes us up to just past 1 o'clock. So I think we'll wrap up. And thanks very much, Jamie and Jason, for discussing these topics, and look forward to the next OzFlux Ecosystem Processes webinar, which will be coming up in July.